Today on Queen Me, I am joined by a storyteller, organizer, and activist whose work is redefining what climate justice looks like on the ground, in the community, and on the page. Denali Sai Nalamalapu is the author of Holler, a graphic memoir of her resistance. It's an urgent and stunning debut that chronicles the fight against the Mountain Valley Pipeline through the eyes of six everyday heroes: a teacher, a nurse, a photographer, and more. Based in Southwest Virginia and leading the grassroots coalition Protect Our Water Heritage Rights, Denali has become a powerful voice in the environmental justice movement, blending direct action with deep care and visual storytelling. Their work has appeared in numerous outlets, and today we're going to talk about love as resistance, the human cost of environmental extraction, and why storytelling may be our most powerful tool for survival and change. Well, thank you so much for joining us and for being here today. It's so wonderful to share this time with you.
Thank you for having me, Ashley.
And like I said before, when we had been talking, I had gotten your new book, and just the visual storytelling is just amazing. And to learn more about, this resistance movement that many people, I think, outside of your area may have never heard of, right? I mean, it's so powerful, and I really want to hear more about that story, right? So what drew you to the Mountain Valley Pipeline fight? And I want to get into you as an organizer and storyteller, but tell us first what drew you to it.
So I grew up actually kind of far from where I live now in Central Appalachia. I grew up in southern Maine and southern India. And so it's not like an intuitive journey that I joined the Mountain Valley Pipeline fight, but I was living in Washington, D.C. and doing climate organizing, and my partner is from Appalachia. And so I spent some time here during the pandemic, and I really fell in love with the mountains. These are some of the most ancient mountains in the world. And you can really tell that in how worn they are. They're very green. I live along the Blue Ridge and I feel very connected to the mountains. And so when I heard about the Mountain Valley Pipeline fight, which has been going on since 2014, but I joined in 2021, and ultimately, it was a decade-long struggle that ended with the pipeline being completed, unfortunately. But I was really interested in working alongside these grassroots organizers who'd been fighting the pipeline for so long in a place that I loved and felt very connected to. And ultimately, I moved here as well. But it was striking to me living in Washington, D.C., which actually is not that far from the Mountain Valley Pipeline route. It's maybe only 3 hours from the closest point of the MVP route, that no one had heard of this massive fracked gas pipeline because it was very much on the national radar that massive oil pipelines were going through parts of the country like Line 3, Keystone XL, and the Dakota Access Pipeline. But in part because of the region this pipeline goes through, it wasn't as much on the national radar that Mountain Valley Pipeline was being fought against and being pushed through these mountains.
Mm. Wow. And it's something that was so fascinating to learn more about, and I feel like too, when something becomes so important to us and passionate for us, like the connection that we grow with it, right? And what I love about your story and work is that you've had this combination of being an organizer and a storyteller. So what does that mean to you to sort of combine both and be in the middle of this?
I definitely see them as equal parts of my life. I think oftentimes creatives, because of capitalism, we're like trying to find a way to get out of our daytime job in order to do our creative work 24/7. And I find that my organizing work is just as important to my creative work as my creative work is to my organizing work, in part because they're very different paces of impacting the world. Like, I find that campaigning, I can see the impact a lot sooner than creative work. This book took me 3 years, and a lot of those 3 years were just me alone in my room talking to friends and mentors about the project. And even now that it's in the world, there's a lot of the impact it'll have on readers that I won't really hear about. I mean, I'm not in touch with every one of my favorite authors about how their books impacted me. And so I don't expect that I'll hear everything from readers of Holler, but having that balance of the other half of the time I'm organizing and campaigning and talking to people about door knocking and canvassing and going to protests. And so I see that direct approach is really helpful with the slower approach of creativity. And I think also they feed my energy in different ways. So if I feel tapped out with organizing, then I tend to feel a lot more excited in that moment about how creativity flexes different things that I'm interested in, different muscles and different tools that I've acquired, and vice versa.
Mm, I love that so much. And the other thing that I love about you too is that your book has followed six local activists. Oftentimes, um, when we're reading new books or when new authors come out, right? It's often about their stories, and we have some of that, but you've highlighted people that are really making a difference and have made a difference in this movement in this community. So why was it important for you to tell their stories? Because you took this approach really as a community member and a journalist, right? So what was that like for you?
From the onset of this project 3 years ago, I was really interested in the reality of this pipeline fight being that it went through very rural, elderly, and poor communities. So it didn't go through a part of the country where there are like paid season activists abound. Like, for example, there are other pipelines where there was more of a mix of the paid activists and the grassroots folks who were impacted by the pipeline. And that was definitely true with MVP as well. But I was really interested in how there were many just ordinary people who used the skills that they already had in their lives to fight the pipeline. I think oftentimes we think of activism as something where you have to be able to give up your life or you have to be young and sort of like impassioned in a particular way. But these people who span different generations were all individuals like nurses, teachers, people who we all have in our families who saw the pipeline go through their community or in some cases go through their land and decided to use those skill sets to fight the pipeline. And my story is a bit different. I am a climate organizer. I've been doing this work since I graduated college. And so I was really interested in being in conversation with and uplifting the stories of people who had a different experience coming into the movement.
Mm, I love that. It's so powerful to hear how different people came into the movements. And one of the things that I've really admired about your work is that you really lead with love as a form of resistance. And in the time that we're in, I see so many young people really struggle because they're really facing this, legal threats and burnout and corporate power and all of these other elements, right? And it's really hard to stay grounded when you're facing all of these things, especially in the world that we live in. So how did you stay grounded? What was your experience like? Because you do lead with the idea that love is a form of resistance.
I think it's very real to feel despairing and distraught in this moment, and that's definitely part of my reality. I don't like live in a happy, optimistic bubble where everything's gonna be okay. So I think that I start there with meeting myself where I'm at rather than trying to repress those feelings of hopelessness and despair. It's important to me as a human being to be doing work all the time that is impacting people. I think that's just been part of who I am since I was a child. I remember like very early on feeling viscerally the weight of injustice, which I talk about a little bit in the introduction of Holler. And so I don't know that for me there's a reality in which I'm not doing work that impacts people in a positive way 24/7. And I chose organizing because I think organizing works. I've studied movements. I'm constantly reading about particularly movements for Black liberation and civil rights and movements around the country against fascism. And I believe that movements, organizing, protesting, that works. And that's why I've chosen my lane in organizing. And then in terms of storytelling, I love writing and art. And I think it's important that people feel like their strengths can be part of their presence in the movement because I'm an introverted, very artsy person. So it's not intuitive that I would have space in organizing or that I would be able to carve out a corner in organizing. I think oftentimes we see people who are more extroverted and excited about being behind the megaphone as the people pictured as part of organizing, which is an important part of organizing. But I think it's important for long-term sustainability in movements that people feel like they can bring the things they're passionate about and the skills they already have into movements. Otherwise, it can be really hard to sustain a version of yourself that doesn't feel energizing and authentic. So I'd say like those are two important parts of how I stay grounded is like genuinely listening to my feelings of despair because those are very real feelings and like the world isn't what we deserve right now. And then also really leaning into what I'm passionate about and how I can bring those skills into the movement. Those are two parts that help me feel grounded as a human being. And then lastly, I feel it's important for people to know what actually helps them in moments of despair. It's not necessarily for all of us that like a bath with good smelling salts or um doing our makeup is exactly what makes us feel better. It's true for some people, and I think that's great that it's true for some people, but for me, it's hiking in the woods and spending a long time with the plants and animals and mountains that I'm protecting. And also, as I said earlier, reading from elders who have been doing this movement work for much longer than I have. Those are two things that help me feel grounded. And I think finding those ways and taking those breaks that aren't actually breaks because they genuinely do end up being part of that organizing work to restore your energy is also an important part of what helps me stay grounded.
Mm, love that. Organizing is such a fascinating, it has such a fascinating history. And to see all the movements and how it shifted, right? And I think for this graphic memoir, I mean, it's so important because you've seen this like this organized at this intersection of race, class, and geography, which I think is important, right? Because the geography is so critical to this. How do those dynamics really show up in this memoir? Because I'm curious about what does it look like to organize at the intersection of all of these things? How did those show up in the movement and the memoir?
I think because I grew up as a kid of color in a majority white state being Maine, and as a child of immigrants, it felt very natural to me to join the climate movement in an intersectional way because I think the history of the climate movement isn't intersectional. Like a lot of the ways that we have previously talked about climate change have been very scientific, have been rooted in like Western thought and dialogue about the way we impact the earth and the way the earth impacts us. But for me, as someone that comes from Southern India, that saw the experience of immigrants in a majority white state being my parents, it felt very natural for me to approach the climate movement with intersectionality, in part because climate change has been impacting India for decades now. in similar and different ways as it's impacting southern Maine and other parts of the US. And so I'm familiar with how parts of our history, like colonization and imperialism and Western dominance over the US, do impact climate change. It doesn't feel like separate things to me. And then, as someone living in Central Appalachia, knowing that the region is very misunderstood by people outside of this part of the country, for example, seeing what happened in November with the presidential election, I see a lot of people blaming people in this region for the outcome of that election. And the reality is that the people in Appalachia aren't a monolith. They aren't all people who voted a certain way, who look a certain way. My experience as a progressive person of color in the region is that there is a huge history of fossil fuel resistance because the fossil fuel industry has been in Appalachia for over a century, and of diversity of thought and experience. And I hope that a book like Holler, in conversation with many other books coming out of the region, can help people add nuance to their relationship with the region, because there is so much to learn from the experience of people who have lived next to fossil fuel projects like the Mountain Valley Pipeline in terms of how we fight climate change. Because one of the biggest villains in the climate change story is the fossil fuel industry. And so, if we're not learning from people who have been fighting this industry for over a century, then I think we as a movement are missing out on a huge wealth of knowledge. And of course, we want everyone and we need everyone in the movement. So we're also missing out on many, many people who have a different perspective or sometimes an overlapping perspective that can help us fight for a better future.
Yeah. It's just continues to be inspiring to hear from you and all the things that you're doing. I want to go back to the storytelling aspect and the strategy in which you chose to do this. So it is a graphic memoir. So it's a really inspiring and unique and bold way to format this, right? Why did you choose this visual storytelling? Like what about this inspired you to do it? And also, how do you see art as a tool for activism?
I remember the moment that I thought that this project would be interesting to spend my time doing, and I was in um a friend's beach house on the coast, on the East Coast in the Carolinas. And I was like getting some rest with other organizers, doing some strategizing, eating a lot of good food. And I was thinking about what was a way that we hadn't yet told the story of the Mountain Valley Pipeline, and who were people that were missing in terms of who we were telling the story to and the ways we were telling the story. And the people that came to mind were young readers, elderly readers, and very busy readers. And I think those three groups of people are people that get missed out by like huge monolithic texts about climate change, because there's a discomfort about, for some readers, about can they actually read that text, and then there's a lack of time for some people, like single mothers juggling multiple jobs and trying to pick up their kid from school, in terms of how much time they can spend with certain books. And as someone who is an artist and a writer, and I started out drawing at a young age in comics, I knew I had this skill set while being a community member and an organizer in this pipeline fight, to also bring that writing and art experience into this project. And so it was like kind of a combination of strategy in terms of who have we missed, and skill set in terms of what skills do I have that I could bring to this, that culminated in this project to being a graphic novel. And I do think comics in particular are uniquely able to be a motive to many, in many different ways, to many different readers. So you have like young readers who might approach comics with less comfort in terms of the actual text, but they get a lot out of the images. You have readers who like the text but don't have a lot of time to read very dense material, who might get a lot out of the text but also be newer to that comic style and those images, but get something out of the illustrations as well. And so I think comics can meet a lot of different people where they're at. And then art more broadly has always been part of movements and has always been part of resistance. And for me, as someone that likes to study and reflect on how our movements are impacting people and how they could do so more effectively, storytelling and art always come up as like something that's very important to bringing very different people into our work. I think it's easy to hit people with statistics and reports, and those are very important things. But if we don't have the element of telling the story of how we got here and telling the story of why the report findings are important to real people's lives, then we will miss people. We'll end up like getting people in ivory towers and university towns and missing people all over urban and rural parts of the country. And so I definitely see the use of art in movements as both strategic and an energizing way to engage in the fight.
Mm. And that's what's so inspiring about you too, is because you have written for other outlets too. And now you have this, right? And what I think a lot of activists can take away from this is that you need to tell your story. You need to share your experiences, right? And and getting out there your words, right? I feel like that's so important. And sometimes we might not talk about that enough or teach that enough. I don't know if you think that as well, but maybe what's some advice you could share to other activists, maybe that want to share their story, but they don't know where to start or don't know what to do next?
Something that I've consistently heard on the book tour of sharing this book with people is that they want to hear more people's stories, and that's a key way that they want to be more engaged in the climate movement. So I would start with the belief that there is a hunger there for people's stories. And I think, as you said, Ashley, there's also an interest in people's stories that are in conversation with other community members' stories or with movement elders or with their families, like different ways of telling our own story in conversation with the world around us. I hear people really wanting. I think for me, there's a balance in terms of how much I want to be at the center of the story and how much I want to share stories in conversation with other people, because I do think that um there are so many different people doing really incredible work out there. Not all of them have the time or interest in spending years and years putting together a narrative like a book and telling their story. And so being in collaboration with other people through journalism or through creative work, I think is really wonderful. And also there are a lot of people doing some really cool collaborations with the natural world in terms of how do we as humans figure out how we can tell in our own imperfect way the story of the natural world. And I would say in terms of advice, something that I've been sitting with is many writers, including um, some of the most prolific writers in contemporary history, say that if you want to write, you just have to sit down and write. And that's something that I think is important to say. I think it's easy to do a lot of scrolling on social media or get distracted and talk about wanting to write and not end up writing. And that's something that I think we all can get sidetracked with. But I would say if you want to write or if you want to create, one important part of doing so is just doing it constantly. And that's something that I was doing prior to writing this book. It's something I was doing during writing this book, and it's something I'm doing now that I'm working on other projects. So one thing I would say is just do it. And another thing I would say is ask people for help. I think it can be hard to ask people for help and hard to know how to ask people for help. But one of the best parts of reflecting on writing this book for me is reflecting on how many people helped me over the 3 years in different ways. And these are people who some were extremely busy and just spent 10 minutes responding to an email from me or spent 30 minutes on the phone with me. And that was so important to my trajectory in terms of making this book possible. So I would say, like, sitting down, doing the writing, asking people for help are two crucial parts of creating. And then the last part for me is reading a lot and like um consuming different ways to tell stories, whether for me it's comics or experimental novels or climate change nonfiction. I think being a voracious reader and going to different art events, supporting different artists of different levels of visibility is also important to creating your own work in innovative and engaging ways.
Mm, mm. So powerful. A lot of young people submit questions to this, and they've submitted so many interesting ones, but one of my favorites that they wanted to ask you is what's giving you hope right now, even as this climate crisis continues to accelerate and so many things are going on in the world. What's giving you hope?
Part of what always gives me hope is going for a hike because the reality of like the ancient mountains I live in or any part of this country is that the natural world is continuing on no matter what happens on the federal stage in the US or what's happening globally. And for those of us that are able to spend time outside, I think being connected with the different pace of life and um, a different kind of freedom from our day-to-day worries is a really beautiful thing about being alive. And I also think that we can get a lot of hope from being in community with each other and seeing the different ways each of us are addressing the climate crisis. For example, my big project this summer is putting solar on my roof. I have friends whose big project is learning more about farming and about how to grow their own food, and I'm learning from them about how to garden in my own home. I think that like being in conversation with each other about different ways that we are engaging in our own climate future, whether it's going to be our dream future where we're actually able to live and thrive in the way that we deserve, or it's going to be something in the middle of what we can get our leaders to do and what we can do on the ground while the climate crisis is intensifying. I think it's really important for me to keep in touch with people around the country, around the world, and also in my own community who are trying to do the day-to-day work of addressing the climate crisis because it can feel very overwhelming to constantly be scrolling on the news and to see huge cuts to environmental regulation, environmental workforces, all of these things that are so important to the climate crisis. So for me right now, spending time outside and building community with people who are like-minded, who believe that we can address the climate crisis and are doing this work in a day to day is really important. And I think that both of those things can be done even if you feel like you haven't been a big part of environmental work previously. Like the reason why I wrote this book is that not all of us are spending all of our time thinking about climate change or doing climate work, but there's so much room for the different ways that we can bring in our own skill sets, whether it's teaching or nursing or seed keeping or being a student activist into the climate movement. And I think that that's important to say because we lose people if people feel like they have to be the most environmentalist, like have the month's worth of their trash in a tiny jar type environmentalist. And I'm not that type of environmentalist. I admire people who are, but there are many different imperfect ways that we can all engage in this fight because it is all of our fights. And I think it's important that we make room for the different ways we're each engaging.
So inspiring, so powerful. And I just love connecting with you and hearing from you. And that's why I'm so excited for this last question, because we end every episode of Queen Moo with this question. What does it mean to unleash your inner queen, and how do you tap into that power in your own life and leadership?
For me, it involves being stubborn. I think that as someone who has observed that the world is not made for people like me and doesn't really want people like me to be visible or tell their story or in some cases exist, being stubborn and just paying attention to what I want to do in collaboration with members of my community is really important because I think there is a lot of noise in this world. There will be a lot of people telling you you can't do what you want to do, whether they have your best interest in mind or not. And for me, just putting my head down and doing what I want to do, no matter if I'm having a day where I'm doubting myself or not, is really important. And I don't think I could have written this book without that learned ability to be stubborn. I think, especially as a person that was socialized to please people and to listen to people, I have to continually remind myself to just keep my mind and my head oriented towards what I want to do. And yes, listen to people around me and learn from the things they're saying. I think like I can learn as much from my critics as I can learn from people who support me, but that's different from letting their um negativity or their disdain or whatever it is, their muddled representation of what they're experiencing in their own lives that they're putting on me, letting that overtake my clarity in terms of what I want to do. And I've found that stubbornness to be one of the most important ways that I've been able to do what I set out to do and kind of complete projects and see them to their end, and through that be able to make the impact on the world that I want to have.
Mm. Amazing, amazing. Your work and your memoir, it's really a love letter to this movement. It's a call to action for environmental justice, and it's a reminder that I think power lives in the community. And you can pre-order this now from Timber Press, and we'll include all of the information to follow along on your journey in our information and the links below and everything. But we're so grateful for your time, for your leadership, and all the work that you're doing. Just thank you so much for being here and for spending time with us. We really appreciate it.
Thanks for having me, Ashley.
Of course. And as always, don't forget to subscribe, share, and leave a review, because every time you do, you help someone else unleash their inner queen. Thanks, everyone.